Welcome everybody to this colloquium. My name is Ute Ritz-Deutch. I teach here in the history department and in the philosophy department. I'm really appreciative that you guys came out for this talk. So today I will talk about President Biden's immigration policies. And to put it in just one word, it is mixed. So some good things happening, but there's also a lot of continuation of Trump administration policy. In terms of acronyms, if I talk about DHS, that's the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, ICEs, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, USCIS is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, TPS is Temporary Protected Status, US RAP is the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, ICCPR is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and CAT is the Convention Against Torture, also known as the Torture Convention. Now, many of you will know that human rights is one of my areas of expertise, both in terms of research and also advocacy. It's what I do outside the classroom as well. What many of you may not know is that the refugee crisis in particular hits very close to home. On my mom's side of the family, at the end of World War II, all of them became refugees. All of them became stateless people. And so that's a trauma that has sort of been passed down, if you will. My mom was 6 years old when that happened. And, my great-grandparents still, to their dying days, at that point they had lived in Germany for 40 years, still considered themselves refugees. So it's sort of identifying with that, and when you have trauma to that degree, it just doesn't leave you. You kind of carry it with you. But so for me, also as an immigrant, these issues are really important. Now, I've been here since the early 1980s. The majority of my life I've spent in this country, and I'm also a naturalized U.S. citizen, but I can very much relate to people who are trying to come here and how difficult it is to do so. So a lot of times you guys may have heard people say, well, why don't they just get in the line? Why don't they just do things, quote unquote, legally? Well, the bottom line is it is extremely difficult to come into this country. And to just give you one example of legal channels that people may be able to pursue, let's say if you have family members and you're trying to come up here under the family reunification program, and let's say you're not a direct relative, meaning a parent or a child, let's say you want to be reunited with a sibling, right, brother, sister. Because we have these yearly caps in terms of how many visas are going to be granted, and that cap is 20,000 per country per year. In many countries, visas have been granted, they have not been issued, because we run up against this cap. So if you are a person going through all the legal channels, you go to the embassies, you prove that you have a certain amount of money in the bank. I think it used to be 30,000 you had to have saved up. I don't know what it is these days, if that has been adjusted upward, but you go through all the channels, you have your paperwork, everything is done properly. The wait list for somebody coming from Mexico used to be 20 years, the backlog, and under Trump it went up to 23 years. So let's say for a moment somebody from Mexico wants to come up here to help her sister raise the children. Well, if you show up 23 years later, you've kind of missed the boat on that one, I guess. So in short, it is actually extremely difficult to enter this country. One of the major obstacles is that, quite frankly, we don't have enough visas. So we have not adjusted our visa caps in many categories since the 1960s, but world population has doubled since, So there are a lot of problems in the way in which immigration is run, and there are significant hurdles for a lot of people who try to come here. Now, as many of you may remember, when President Trump took office, like in those first few weeks, he issued a flurry of executive orders. Some of them were subsequently challenged in court. You may remember the so-called Muslim ban, for example, and then the administration had to sort of tweak it and rewrite it a little bit, and it went through 4 separate iterations before it actually withstood scrutiny. Now, with the Biden administration, something very similar happened in the sense that the first week in office, President Biden issued a flurry of executive orders, many of them trying to undo what President Trump had done. And from a human rights perspective, let me just say that President Trump's administration was disastrous. You know, they came in, even on day one, publicly proclaiming that this administration will not be guided by human rights. So, you know, they made no bones about that. But the problem then, making these changes through executive order, is that one, the next president can undo them, but also, ultimately, action has to happen in Congress. You know, so especially when it comes to immigration reform, and it's just been very difficult to get Congress to act on this issue. So looking at Trump's legacy, according to the Immigration Policy Tracking Project, President Trump enacted over 1,000 policy changes while in office, and nearly 100 dealt with just asylum and asylum seekers. So we've had a flurry of action. Some of them were executive orders, some of them were policy changes, and then if you look at what they refer to as the sub-procedural level, a lot of these policy changes cannot even be changed all that quickly. And there's actually also a lot of entrenchment in government agencies. So unwinding these regulations will require the government to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking, followed by a public comment period. And this process alone could take months or years. So what is really important here, again, is that a lot of these changes happened at the sub-regulatory level. So even if you push through an executive order, that doesn't mean that changes are going to take effect. And also, just as happened during the Trump administration, after President Biden issued his flurry of executive orders, many of these are now being challenged in court. That's an ongoing issue. In terms of the so-called Muslim travel ban, Biden did issue executive orders to undo those, but in terms of what has happened practically, because of COVID, there's still a lot of restrictions. It is, you know, because of COVID, almost impossible to really come into the country, even though if technically now you're allowed to do so. Now, under the Trump administration, we had the so-called Remain in Mexico policy that basically prevents asylum seekers who come to the border, who surrender themselves to Custom and Border Protection, who are here to seek asylum. It prevents them from doing so. In short, it basically denies people their due process rights. The thing that I'm going to do throughout this talk here today is make a twofold argument. One is humanitarian, and the other one is legal. We can make a humanitarian argument that refugees should be allowed to come here, that asylum seekers should be allowed to present their case, and then the government decides whether or not they have a valid case, especially since we have so many crisis areas around the world. Our withdrawal from Afghanistan was just the latest, right, but not by far the only one. Given all of that and the fact that we are the wealthiest country and the strongest economy in the world, even with COVID, one could argue that we have a humanitarian obligation. And I'm going to make a philosophical argument here too. Let's say if you are walking by a lake and you see somebody drowned and nobody else is around, you're a good swimmer, you see somebody drowning, do you have a moral obligation to save that person if you could? Now, the story might be a little bit different if there are 100 people at the beach who could be saving that person, but assuming you're the only one, right, would you have a moral obligation to do that? So you can make a strong argument on ethical and moral grounds that yes, indeed, you would have that obligation. Obviously, not everybody would agree with that. But if you then project that onto the obligations of the state, would the wealthiest state in the world have a moral obligation to help others who are basically metaphorically drowning. You know, you can extend that argument to say, yes, there is a moral obligation. But if we look at it from a legal perspective, we absolutely have a legal obligation to do so. And that is something that the administration has oftentimes skirted. And, you know, we have an obligation both in terms of domestic law and international law to process asylum seekers, to give them access to a hearing, to be able to present their case. Countries have an obligation to process asylum seekers. Governments do not have to grant every asylum seeker asylum, but they have to make a good faith effort to determine whether or not somebody's claim is valid. You know, so, and in that, the United States, and not just under the Trump administration, also under the Obama administration, Bush administration, previous administrations, and including the Biden administration, is not living up to its legal obligations to protect people. So one of the things that is happening is that so-called expedited removal to Central America continues. And expedited removal means that somebody comes to the border, they try to apply for asylum, which is a human right to do. And I will talk a little bit about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights later. Okay, they come to the border to seek asylum. Instead of giving them access, we return them before they even have their chance to have their case heard, before they have their chance to even have their case filed. So that is expedited removal. You know, oftentimes what happens, we have people coming up from Central America, from places like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. They travel all the way through Mexico, which is a very dangerous trip. They come to the border, they get rejected, they get forced back into Mexico, or sometimes they just get put on a plane and they're flown to southern Mexico, and then Mexico deports them to Guatemala or Honduras. So if we look at Mexico as well, Mexico is violating its international obligations as well. So we had, during the Trump administration, nearly 4,000 children separated from their parents at the border. So a few years ago, that really caused a lot of backlash. Also from the international community, that was just really shocking that we would separate sometimes very little children, you know, toddlers, from their parents, put them in detention facilities, ship them around the country, deport their parents. This policy, which the Trump administration called zero tolerance, was not halted until the courts intervened. And there have been efforts since then to try and reunify some of these children with their parents, but there are many of them, several hundreds, that could not be located. Let's say they're deported back to Guatemala. The Guatemalan embassy doesn't necessarily know where they are. So of the nearly 4,000 children that were separated, as of June of this year, 2,000 still remain separated. And like I said, well, several hundred cases, the parents could not be located. So another thing that happened under the Trump administration is the United States Refugee Admissions Program was basically gutted. We used to have the capacity to take in refugees. It is actually a federal law. We have the U.S. Refugee Act of 1980 that basically lays out the government's obligation in terms of processing refugees. We took out, during certain years, more than 100,000 refugees. So for example, you may have heard the term boat people, right? Vietnamese boat people. So there were a lot of people from Southeast Asia that came over to the United States. Since that program came into being, so 1980, the Refugee Act, and then we have the Refugee Settlement Agency created at that same time. Millions of people have come to the country that way. I don't know of one of them who's been convicted of terrorist activities, you know, so that, just to lay that out. But so we used to have a capacity to process people, and that has basically been gutted. The last year of the Obama administration, the goal was to take in 100,000 refugees. Each year that was reduced to where the last year during the Trump administration, it got ratcheted down to 15,000. We never even reached that limit. And President Biden has sort of been wishy-washy about it. great promises during his campaign, and initially, saying we're going to take in 100,000 and then ratcheting that down. And then because of a lot of pushback from immigrant rights organizations, he then said, well, okay, we'll do 65,000. Okay, that was the fiscal year 2021 that just ended, September 30th. And as of that date, only 11,000 something people were admitted. So not even 12,000. Okay, so we didn't even reach the cap that the Trump administration had in place. So some of that is because the court stepped in and tried to basically stay some of the executive orders and policy changes of the Biden administration. Some of it has to do with the fact that the refugee agency has been gutted. So what happens, let's say you're a resettlement agency, so that might be, for example, Catholic Charities in Ithaca. There was a resettlement agency in Binghamton as well. And let's say you have several people on your staff, you're getting funded by the government to help resettle people, so you have to apply for grants, you get that money based on how many people you're processing. Well, what if suddenly you're processing 0 because the government's not letting anybody through? Your funding's gone. How are you going to pay your people? You're going to let them off. Either people quit and find work elsewhere, or they're let go. So how are you going to start then if resettlement agencies have already closed their doors, or if they're totally under capacity? How are you going to bring that back up to suddenly then deal with the surge of refugees that we're supposed to be processing? So those were among the things that happened during the Trump administration. There were also really some last minute, what I think of as shenanigans that happened. This happened like the last few days under the Trump administration. For example, we had the so-called SAFE agreements, Sanctuary for Americans First enactment agreement, that would basically require DHS, Department of Homeland Security, to give states 180 days notice for comment before new regulations can go into effect. So in other words, it tried to prohibit the Biden administration from issuing executive orders by preventing them automatically from going into effect for half a year, almost. Another one of these was ICE, again, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They have a union, and they entered into an agreement with DHS that would have allowed ICE to indefinitely delay changes to immigration and enforcement policies and practices. So again, you have laws, you have executive actions, but then a lot of stuff sort of happens at the sub-regulatory level. And once President Biden took office, then DHS basically disapproved the agreement. But I mean, there were all kinds of things like that that were basic last-minute attempts to basically tie Biden's hands. So when Biden ordered an end to remain in Mexico, a policy that under the Trump administration was known as migration protection protocols, the state of Texas sued the administration, and then the court ruled that the policy must resume, which is kind of mind-boggling because the Remain in Mexico policy, again, would prevent asylum seekers from coming to the United States and staying here until their case is being heard. It forced them back into Mexico. That policy in and of itself is in violation of international law. So it kind of boggles my mind that we can have courts here basically upholding policies that are so blatantly illegal. So we had a 100-day moratorium on deportation that was also blocked by a Texas judge. And in February, we had a flurry of executive orders. In February, Biden issued new priorities for ICE that basically would restrict deportations to those who pose a national security threat. What we had under the Obama administration is we had prioritization. That meant that DHS and ICE, which is a branch within DHS, should not target people unless they actually had a violent criminal record, unless they actually posed a threat to the national security of this country. Okay, that prioritization was basically undone under the Trump administration, meaning they went after anyone and everyone they could get, and the majority of those people had no criminal record at all. And many of them were people who had been here for decades, who had US citizen spouses, US citizen children. The other thing that happened under the Trump administration is that people who had come here, and they may not have been entering without documentation, they may have come here with visas and then overstayed them, but if you come here and it's unlawful entry, that would be criminalized, and it used to be considered an administrative violation, in other words, civil law. So under Trump that was criminalized, and basically what happened here is that the courts got completely clogged up. So it wasn't so much that more people were deported under Trump, but that more people were detained for longer periods of time. So this is something that Biden has tried to say. He issued new priorities again in February to sort of clarify the executive order from January, and basically again saying the new priorities for ICE should be to only go, or to first go after people who actually pose a national security threat. Okay, you can have that policy, but what happens again at the day-to-day practical level? So there's a lot of entrenchment, and people working for ICE, people working for DHS, oftentimes just do not follow those priorities. So it's been a real challenge for any administration to sort of rein in that branch of Homeland Security. Also more recently, Haiti has experienced a lot of political turmoil, a lot of natural disasters, as recently as August, massive earthquakes. So they should actually be granted temporary protective status. And if you go to the website of Homeland Security, they actually say, oh yeah, Haitians, they qualify for temporary protected status. Well, we've been deporting them by the thousands. So again, we can have something that's official policy. What happens on the ground is oftentimes very different. So as Biden was running for president, he made some promises. Number one, to undo the harm done by the Trump administration's punitive and cruel policies. And basically, we can understand the Biden administration's policies to be that, an effort to undo harm. Again, sometimes they've been thwarted in their effort, but it's not really coming up with something new. It's not really like a new policy. It's a very reactive policy to just try and undo some of the things that happened under the previous administration. Restoring humanity and a respect for human rights into the system, eliminating systemic harms against Black and brown communities. And here I'm going to quote, this was in a talk that he gave to commemorate the Scottsboro massacre. Here we go, quote, to advance racial justice through the whole of our government, to root out systemic racism from our laws, our policies, and our hearts, end quote. So, in my assessment, overall change has been slow, it has been uneven, and from a human rights perspective, especially regarding immigration detention and access to asylum, we're actually going backwards. Now, looking at some human rights standards, part of the statistics here that I've gotten come from an Amnesty International report, needs improvement, a progress report on the Biden administration's records on making the United States a safe refuge. One of the sentences I'm going to quote here is, under international law, the US government has an obligation to ensure that the human rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants are respected, protected, and fulfilled. Now, some people say, well, what do we care about international law? This is the United States, we take care of our own. But let me point out to you Article 6 of the US Constitution, which has a whole list of things that are supreme law of the land, and that includes treaties. Okay, treaties that this country has ratified are supreme law of the land. It supersedes domestic law. In short, we do actually have an obligation, a legal obligation, to those international treaties that we ratified. The US has ratified several of these human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including the CAT, the Torture Convention. And again, what we're doing today is actually in violation of those. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document, it's one of the founding pillars of international human rights norms today. There are 30 articles. This was actually a brainchild of the United States, the creation of the United Nations. We were in leadership at that point, wanting to make that happen. And we did sign on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 14 is everyone has the right to seek asylum. So again, that is actually a human right. Everyone has the right to seek asylum. Now, we had in 1951 the Convention relating to the status of refugees. Initially, that was mostly concerned with refugees in Europe. In the wake of World War II, there were more than 10 million refugees just in Europe alone. I would say at least 15 million. The United States did not ratify that, but it did ratify the 1967 protocol. And again, that was codified through the 1980 Refugee Act, which is domestic law, that is federal law. So what needs to happen is a legal presumption of liberty for immigrants and asylum seekers. They should not be detained while they await the outcome of their case, and they should not be forced to wait in Mexico. There's also a Convention on the Rights of the Child. Actions concerning children should be guided by the best interests of the child. And again, if we have family separation, where little kids sometimes are torn away from their mothers, that is in clear violation of that particular convention. And under the Torture Convention, we have this non-refoulement clause, which basically means no country is allowed, and that includes us, we are not allowed to send people back to countries where we know they're going to be tortured. So a lot of times when, let's say, we have asylum seekers coming up here, they have torture claims. Let's say they've been targeted in El Salvador, maybe several of their family members have already been assassinated. They come up here. We are not allowed to send them back. But that's exactly what we have been doing. All right, let's take a look at immigrant detention. So under the Trump administration, we had during the course of a year like 400,000 people detained. That was a daily average with more than 42,000 immigrants. In certain points in time, it went up to 50,000, people detained on any given day. So that's a daily average. And we had significantly more non-criminals arrested in communities. Like I said, that's because we pulled away from actually having a priority system of who we target. Now, numbers under Obama were like 32,000 daily average, which is still pretty appalling. Obama was, by immigrant rights advocates, referred to as the deporter-in-chief. More people were deported under the Obama administration than any other administration. And even if we compare the numbers for the first Obama administration, those first years, he still deported more people than Trump managed to do. And some of that actually also has to do with how we count deportation. So under Obama's figures, that included people who were turned away at the border. Those numbers may not have been included in the Trump administration figures. But what I mentioned already previously is that under Trump, many more non-criminals were targeted. So ICE went into communities where people had been living for, 20, 30 years with no criminal record, and they targeted anybody they could get their hands on. So that was part of the problem, and that people spent longer periods of time in prison. So the time from arrest, detention to deportation under Obama was supposedly 30 days. And under Trump, it was significantly longer. But even under Obama, I personally knew people who were in immigrant detention for 2.5 years and more, still fighting deportation. So early on in the administration, like in February, so this is just, the first month after taking office, when Trump also tried to have a 100-day moratorium for deportations, which then was challenged in the courts. So in February, the Biden administration had detained 13,860. But then by June, the numbers were up to 25,000. So even by June, the numbers were almost approaching Obama-era levels. So in terms of Department of Homeland Security, they've kind of reverted to a blanket use of detention as people arrive at the border. In terms of detention and public health, there is a public health quarantine, Title 42. You guys may have heard of Title 42. So that's basically saying that because of the pandemic, that we can just turn people away at the border. But this has been misapplied to prevent people from having access to basically file their asylum claim. So this policy, Title 42, which came into being under the Trump administration, is being continued under the Biden administration. And it is this policy that has made it possible for us to recently deport thousands of Haitians who've tried to come here. We also have a problem in terms of health issues with ICE, again, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, detention facilities. They did a really horrible job. I mean, first of all, if you're in detention, you cannot socially distance. They did a really horrible job not giving people protective gear, not offering vaccines. And then they also did something like just moving people around willy-nilly against CDC guidelines. So I personally know of cases where they moved people from New Jersey up here to Batavia, New York, and then suddenly, that's our federal immigrant detention facility here for upstate New York, and COVID cases there went through the roof, you know. We had outbreaks in New Jersey. What did they do? They just shipped people up here. So those kinds of policies. So in ICE detention, COVID rates are 5 times higher than in regular prisons and 20 times higher than in the general population. And let me just point out to you that if you're in detention, it does not mean that you have been charged with a crime. It does not mean you've been convicted of a crime. You're in detention while you await your immigration hearing. And the majority of people in immigrant detention have no criminal records. I just want to make that clear. So again, Biden continues Trump's Title 42 policy, expelling people at the border. Now here was a fascinating and really disturbing statistic. From March 2020, so Trump was still in office then, to March 2021, the government expelled 875,000 people, especially black and brown immigrants and asylum seekers. And Biden, just from February to May, just 2 months, he expelled 400,000 of those. You know, so that's just mind-boggling. Again, if you compare that with the rhetoric of promises. Again, if we look at this Remain in Mexico policy, also known as Migration Protection Protocols, from 2019 until 2021, DHS sent over 70,000 non-Mexicans to Mexico. So these are mostly people from Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, but also Honduras, but also people from Cuba and Venezuela. So 25,000 of them were sent to Tamaulipas, a community in Mexico that the U.S. State Department considers level 4, do not travel, okay? The advice that they give, if anybody from the U.S. is traveling to that region, is make your will and testament before you leave. Have a power of attorney for somebody to handle your financial affairs. Have somebody assigned to take care of your children in case you don't come back. Okay, that is level 4. And that is where we send asylum seekers. And again, the right to seek asylum is a human right. Now here, what may even be more shocking, since Biden took office, Human Rights First has tracked over 6,000 kidnappings, sexual assaults, and other brutal violence against asylum seekers who have been blocked from entering the United States. And in terms of family reunification and unaccompanied children, Biden created the Family Reunification Task Force, so that was something positive, trying to help families that were separated under the previous administration. But like I said, out of 4,000 children separated under Trump, nearly 2,000 of them were still not reunified by June of this year. Now, when we talk about minors, we're talking about, people under the age of 18. According to some government policies, it's people under the age of 16. But we do have a problem with people trying to enter. So from January to June, we had approximately 50,000 unaccompanied minors that crossed into the United States, and 10,000 of them were returned to Mexico within hours or days at most. Now we have unaccompanied children who are processed at so-called emergency intake sites. So that's better than processing them at a detention facility, but it's still not great. And we have reports of basically substandard care, for example, and a lot of these kids are already extremely traumatized. And like I said, if they come up from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. Many of them are fleeing violence. Many of them have lost family members. They're already traumatized, and traveling to Mexico is dangerous in and of itself, and a lot of people get kidnapped, for example, on that journey as well. All right, temporary protective status. Oh my goodness, I always have so much to say. So little time. Okay, so temporary protected status, people in the US who are affected by war or natural disasters can get temporary relief, and that includes work permit, but not permanent immigration status. So that's, let's say, Haiti, massive earthquakes and so on, or other natural disasters or civil war. We allow people to come in to give them temporary protection, but that does not give them long-term permanent status. So we've been giving people TPS, temporary protected status, for decades. So some people have been here for 20, 30 years or more. By October 2020, we had over 400,000 TPS holders, and many of them, like I said, have actually been deported, and many of them have not been even able to apply for TPS status. And so that includes the deportation of thousands of Haitians just this summer. And just in the last few weeks, over 2,000 of them were recently deported without even being able to get to intake processing. The senior U.S. envoy for Haiti resigned in protest over this policy. Now, about refugee protection, as I mentioned previously, even though the bans against Muslims and Africans has been rescinded through executive order by President Biden because of COVID, many people are still not able to come in. And again, we fell far short of the promises in terms of how many refugees are actually able to come in. The Trump administration's dismantling of the refugee admission program, I was already mentioning earlier, but in regards to Afghanistan, it has just been horrific. I mean, obviously, we saw the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. It was a real mess. It was a disaster. Obviously, it could have been done a lot better. So I'm not trying to justify by any means the failure of the Biden administration. But having said that, the fact that the Trump administration dismantled the refugee resettlement program made it extremely difficult even for Afghan refugees to get processed. So for example, the Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban. They came up with this timeline for drawing US troops. But it would take like 2 to 3 years for somebody in Afghanistan, people who have worked with US forces, to go through this entire process to get a visa approved. It's ridiculous. These are people we could have gotten out. We could have gotten out years ago. And Afghans coming here with a special immigrant visa, those are people who have actually worked with the US military, let's say on bases, for example. That's a separate visa category. We also have P visas, so that's priority visas. That's a different category that might be used by people who are translators, for example, and who've worked in other capacities. But essentially, it is almost impossible for people to get out of Afghanistan. And since August 31st, it's become even worse. The place is kind of landlocked. People cannot cross the land borders. It's really difficult to fly out. But a lot of that is because of these bureaucratic hurdles that were put into place by the previous administration, despite promises, that, hey, here are our allies. These people worked with us. They risked their lives. We promised them we would protect them. Despite those promises, the whole system had been gutted, basically. So we left, according to some estimates, in the very least, tens of thousands of people behind. According to some other estimates, more than 100,000 people behind. These were people we should have been able to get out. In terms of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, are you guys familiar with DACA? Some of you are. Not everybody? Okay. So DACA, D-A-C-A, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So this was administrative policy. It went into effect in 2012, and it gave protection to young people who came here as children who were under the age of 16. There were all kinds of stipulations. You needed to have arrived by a certain date, you couldn't be older than a certain age, you could not have any felony criminal record, you had to have graduated from high school or gotten a GED or joined the military. There were some very specific rules, but the reasoning is these young people came here as children, their parents brought them. They had no say as to whether or not to come. Oftentimes when they came, they were toddlers. They don't even have any memories of the country that they came from, be that Mexico or someplace else. And that these children should not be penalized, for something that their parents did. But again, you need to have no criminal record, basically be the outstanding person that we would like then to grant citizenship down the road. DACA itself only gave relief from deportation for 2 years. So that's all it meant. You're not going to get deported for 2 years, and during those 2 years we will give you a work permit. And then every 2 years you have to renew. Okay, you have to pay like $450 every time you renew, so none of this paperwork incurred any cost for the federal government. Under Trump it went up to where you had to renew every year, so it kind of doubles your fees, and a lot of people could not afford that. But there have been efforts to at least protect that group of undocumented people. But action has to happen in Congress. So when Donald Trump ran for office, when he was a candidate, he made statements such as, I love the Dreamers, I'm going to protect them, they're great for our country. But then once he was in office, he actually tried to shut the whole thing down. All of this went to court. The administration was actually forced to resume taking applications, so this was very contentious. Now, while a Texas judge ruled that DACA was initially illegally created, so now there are some procedural issues that Biden is now filing to keep things going. But there is a so-called U.S. Citizenship Act that was introduced to Congress and that would provide a pathway to citizens for Dreamers and people with TPS, temporary protected status. And let me just briefly say, oftentimes things get conflated. There's actually a difference between DACA recipients and Dreamers. Dreamers more generally, and we've had legislation introduced for the DREAM Act. So Dreamers more generally would actually get a pathway to legal status, whereas DACA recipients just have this very temporary protection. And with Dreamers, you would not have these age limits and so on. So it's if it were to pass, that would be more generous. So in terms of positive developments, Biden did create that task force to reunite families, but it's limited and it does not provide relief to those who have already been deported. So that's an issue. The U.S. Citizenship Act that I just mentioned, that has been introduced to Congress. Honestly, I have no idea if that's going to gain any traction in Congress. It's been extremely difficult to get bipartisan support for any of these measures for comprehensive immigration reform. And then we've had the introduction of the so-called Welcomed Act, which is the acronym for Welcoming Evacuees Coming from Overseas to Mitigate Effects of Displacement. So basically we're talking about Afghan refugees, right? If that were to get passed, Afghan parolees, and parolee, it's a weird word. When we normally think of parolee in terms of criminal law, we think of people who have served a sentence and are being paroled. But here with Afghan parolees, it just means it's a very specific legal category that they're in. Afghan parolees would have access to the same resettlement services as refugees who are resettled through the Refugee Admissions Program and are holders of SIVs, the special immigrant visas. And that would include refugee medical assistance, English language classes, housing assistance, job training, and help to enroll children in school. So, there are some positive things, as I mentioned previously. A lot of times it's the courts that are blocking certain initiatives, and sometimes things are allowed to move forward because the Supreme Court is actually blocking an injunction. So that was the case with the Remain in Mexico policy. But sometimes one may also argue that the Biden administration has just lacked sufficient political will. So that's just my own personal opinion here. And I would like for a moment to get back to Haiti. So we have a temporary protective status. It's not just affecting Haitians, but again, the purpose is to give people reprieve, if their country is in disarray, either because of natural disasters or a civil war, political turmoil. Haiti, just because of its location, oftentimes suffers severe consequences from hurricanes, and then you have landslides, and we've had a lot of waterborne diseases as a consequence thereof in recent years. But in terms of the political turmoil, recently the president of Haiti was assassinated, so that kind of contributes to this political turmoil. So on slide 16 under Haiti, my last entry there, we have among the people arrested for the assassination of the Haitian president are 4 graduates of WINSEC. That's the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, previously known as School of the Americas. So School of the Americas basically means here in Fort Benning, Georgia, we are training people. We are training them militarily. A lot of the people who've been trained through the School of the Americas, mostly people from Latin America, then returned home. Many of them became military dictators. Many of them became high-ranking military officials. Many of them were involved in grave human rights violations, and that includes torture, disappearing people, and killing people. Now, whenever we've had these tremendous human rights violations in Latin America, often people who perpetrated those crimes were graduates from the School of the Americas. So some years back, it was renamed WINSEC, Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, but it still operates along the same lines. The people here arrested for assassinating the Haitian president were from Colombia, but one of the things we no longer have, we used to actually get a list of graduates when it was still School of the Americas, and you can go down the checklist, who was responsible for the assassination of Berta Cáceres, the environmental activist in Honduras a few years ago. It's like whenever you look at these types of human rights violations, oftentimes you can trace it back to here, where we have militarily trained people in these methods that violate human rights. So what I'm trying to say here is that a lot of countries that are sending refugees really are volatile, not just because things are going wrong there, and it's not as if the US is to blame for everything. There's a lot of corruption in places, for example, but oftentimes the US has had a hand to play in all of that, whether or not it's political, whether or not it's economic policies. So one of the things that I find really lacking from the larger discourse as it plays out here in the United States is really serious recognition of root causes and how much the US has actually been responsible for creating some of those root causes. So, I kind of wanted to end on that note, but basically to recap, Biden as a candidate made tremendous promises. One of those promises was that we would take in more than 100,000 refugees for the next fiscal year. We now have a target of 67,000, I believe he wanted to admit, but this last fiscal year we admitted fewer than 12,000. That's at a moment where we have an unprecedented refugee crisis in the world with more than 80 million people who are displaced. And again, we are the most powerful country in the world. So you can certainly make a humanitarian argument, but what I laid out earlier in my talk is that we also have legal obligations, both in terms of domestic law, federal law, and in terms of international law. And we're not meeting those obligations. A couple of good things have happened, but the policy has definitely been mixed. And in some ways, we're kind of sliding backwards from where we were last winter and spring. All right, guys. Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you, by chance, did not get a handout but would like one, I can email you one.